Glory and praise to our Lord. Welcome everyone from the Catholic Homeschool Conference to my talk, Three Levels of Historical Reading. I am Philip Campbell. I'm a history teacher for Homeschool Connections, and I'm an author of several historical books. You might know me as the author of the Story of Civilization series from Tan Books, Heroes and Heretics of the Reformation, my newest book from Tan, The Story of the Church, and many other historical textbooks and works of nerdy historical interest. If you want to learn more about my writing, you can visit my website, philipcampbell.net, and I'll mention that again at the end of this talk. But I am here today to talk to you about reading historical texts, specifically primary sources, and how we can use historical reading to build up our reading skills. Now, I've always supported and spoken out in favor of reading primary sources. If you want to know more about what a primary source is, I encourage you to visit my website and look up the article, Drinking History from the Font, Primary Sources, which I wrote about this. But a primary source is basically when you're reading an actual document that comes from the historical period you are studying. So, for example, if you're studying the American Revolution, then actually reading the Declaration of Independence, that's a primary source. That's different from a secondary source, which is like if you're reading a textbook about the Revolution. So I have always assigned primary sources for reading. I think it's the best way to really immerse yourself in history and learn, what was really going on, what the people in various historical periods were thinking and how they wrote and spoke and viewed the world. But today we're going to talk about how to use primary sources to study history and build reading skills at the same time, because a huge part of studying history is reading, especially when you're reading a primary source. It can challenge you because you're reading something sometimes written hundreds or thousands of years ago in a different sort of way of speaking, sometimes ways that the student is not familiar with. So it can really challenge you, just not just from a historical level, but just from a reading standpoint of building our reading skills. So I want to talk about how to use these primary sources to become better readers and also become more historically literate. So this talk is called Three Levels of Historical Reading. And what this means is that when we take a historical source and we read it, there's really three different levels that we can read that source at. And these three levels, I'm going to repeat them many times if you're taking notes. Number one, basic retention. Number two, inferential reading. And number three, critical analysis. So basic retention, inferential reading, and critical analysis. And I'm going to spend the rest of this talk breaking down these three types of historical reading, explaining what we do with them and the benefits of each and how they help our reading skills. So the first type of historical reading, the most basic type of historical reading, is what I would call basic retention. And when we're reading a text, a primary source, with an aim of basic retention, this is simply the ability to read the text and retain the basic information about the content, to answer the basic questions. What is the text talking about? Who are the characters? When does it take place? Essentially, what is going on, right? We're just trying to understand what's happening in a text, in a story. So, for example, let's take a random historical text. I don't know. Let's take like the Julius Caesar's History of the Gallic Wars. So if we're reading this text, we're simply asking ourselves at the level of basic retention, what's going on in the story? Who's talking? Okay, it's Caesar. What is he narrating? He's talking about the Romans fighting the Gauls, right? Who's the bad guy? Oh, Vercingetorix. Okay, that's the antagonist, right? So we're just looking for the basic content. If I were to just come back and ask you, what did you read? What's the story about? That's basic retention. Okay, so, or as Dr. Russell, who's another homeschool connections teacher, says, these are who struck John sorts of questions. That means just asking the student what happened, who struck John, right? You read the story and just answer basic questions about it. So what sort of skills does this build? Well, practicing basic retention helps students to recognize the narrative structure of historical events, which is very important. It helps them to answer the basic who, what, when, where, why of reading a text, and it builds comprehension. Comprehension is when we're looking at a piece of writing and just answering the question, what is this text trying to tell me, right? What did I just read? That's very basic. When is this appropriate? I would say that for primary sources, it's appropriate for middle school, probably 7th, 8th grade. I don't assign primary sources earlier than that. Like for elementary school, primary sources are kind of hard to sort through. Middle school, definitely. So at middle school, that's when I start assigning kids primary sources and ask them, okay, what happened in the story? And a good way to assess what happened is to just give the student a basic quiz or discussion of asking them to recap the story. So for example, I teach many different history courses for Homeschool Connections. One of the classes I teach is modern European history, which goes from 1789 to like 1991, I think. And there's a reading we always do about something called the Sepoy Mutiny. The Sepoy Mutiny was an event in 1857 in India this is when the British ruled India, and the British employed Indians in the British Army, and they were called Sepoys. And in 1857, all the Sepoys mutinied. They rebelled against British rule. And I have a reading that I assign about a family that lived through the Sepoy Mutiny. They're living in Delhi. This is the Greethid family. The narrator is the wife, Eliza Greethid, and she tells the story. She says, hey, we were coming home from church one Sunday, and we got home, and we heard all this commotion in the city. We saw the smoke going up, and then our friend, this other army officer, came up to our house, and he said, guys, you got to hide. The Sepoys are mutinying all over the city, and they're attacking British people all throughout the city of Delhi. So Miss Greethid talks about how they hid in their house and how this mob of Indians came up the driveway. And then she talks about how their servant, Golab Khan, helped to hide the family in the garden while he distracted the Sepoys. And then the family ran away to go stay with friends named Mr. and Mrs. Cookson, waiting behind the British lines, and then how their house got ransacked. So I'll assign that reading, and if we're taking an approach of just basic retention, after I assign the reading, then I would ask questions like, so what happened? Who is the narrator? What happened Sunday morning after they came home from church? What did Golab Khan, the gardener, tell the rioters? How did the family escape? Who are the Cooksons? Basically ask them to regurgitate facts from the reading. And the purpose is nothing other than to just get the student to focus on the who, what, when, and where of the story. Just basic retention, comprehension, what happened. And this is something, obviously, a skill students build as they're reading any text throughout their whole, young adult life. But when we're looking at historical primary sources, it's very important because, as I said, primary sources can be a little bit more challenging to read. So it helps acquaint the students with going through a challenging text and picking out, understanding, okay, this is what's going on. Who is the protagonist? What is happening? What is this text trying to tell me? That's very important when we're reading history, but really reading anything. So when I'm first introducing historical text to students, this is the first thing I do in middle school. Just try to get them to understand, okay, here's what's happening. It's very basic, and I think we all understand that. So I won't spend too much more time on this one because the second one is actually more important. The second type of historical reading is inferential reading, inferential reading. Now, with basic retention, we are just looking at the ability to read and just understand what's going on, right? What is the text trying to say? With the second type of reading for history, inferential reading, we're taking the information in the text and we're reading between the lines, so to speak, to see what the text infers that might not be explicitly said. Because when we communicate, we're always saying something, right? Even if we're not saying something. You get what I mean? There's cues and clues and inferences that come through when we communicate that aren't always explicitly spelled out, but they're communicated nonetheless, right? And this can be just little little tidbits, about a story, little factual things. Like if I say, like, if you were to ask me, like, what's the worst accident you ever had, and I say, oh man, one time I slipped and fell on the ice and blah blah blah. Now, I didn't explicitly say it was winter, right? But by saying I fell on the ice, you infer that it was winter, right? Even though you think, oh, this must have taken place in the winter, even though I didn't say it. By mentioning ice, you know it happened in the winter. So very basic example. Also, I can reveal biases, in how I speak. Like if you ask me about, some experience with some other person, and I'm like, oh yeah, that guy, blah blah blah. The way I speak, you can tell, like, okay, he doesn't like that guy. The way he's talking about him. I might not have to say, like, oh yeah, Bob is a jerk, but you can tell that I think that by the way I'm talking. So we're always communicating unspoken things whenever we're doing any sort of communication, and that is certainly true in history. It comes across in historical writing all the time. So by teaching students inferential reading, to read by inference, we can teach them to be attentive to ways that a text communicates something beyond what the author wants. So basic retention, the first type of reading, asks, what is the text trying to say? Inferential reading asks us to recognize, what does the text say that it might not be trying to, but that it does anyway? Okay? So the skills this builds for readers is inference, and recognizing inference as a whole set of skills in itself. Seeing textual clues, like learning to recognize clues in reading that might not be explicitly spelled out. It's very age appropriate for when we get into high school, as kids start doing a more intensive study of literature. So being able to recognize clues and make inferences are very important for this type of reading. Now, I teach a class for high school at Homeschool Connections called Modern U.S. History, 1865 to 2000, and I always give this reading on the Homestead Strike of 1892. And the Homestead Strike was where there were these workers in Andrew Carnegie's steel mill in Homestead, Pennsylvania. And this is during like the age of the great age of like the Rockefellers and the robber barons and industrialization. So back when working conditions weren't great. So you have all these workers at this steel mill, and they're trying to negotiate with Carnegie for $1, a $1 raise. And Carnegie doesn't want to have it, so they go on strike. And the strike gets very big, it gets out of control, and Carnegie hires an agency called the Pinkertons. The Pinkertons were like a private security, I guess nowadays we'd call them a private security firm. They're like hired muscle, strike breakers, basically. Carnegie hires the strike breakers to come in and bust up this Homestead Strike. Well, the strikers are ready for the Pinkertons, and they're armed with all these weapons, and this battle actually breaks out on the banks of this river in Homestead, Pennsylvania. And the Pinkertons are outnumbered, they're outgunned, and after this battle, they surrender. Like it's actually, they take prisoners, they lock them up as if it's a real battle. It was one of the biggest conflicts in the history of labor labor relations in the United States. The Pinkertons get beaten, they surrender. Now, the whole event was witnessed by a reporter from the Illustrated American magazine, and he wrote up an article about the Homestead strike that was published retelling the events of the strike. And I have the article, and I have the students read it. And I have them guess who the author sympathizes with. Now, the author doesn't say who he sympathizes with, right? He doesn't say who he sympathizes with, but we can infer it by the language he uses. For example, how does he talk about Carnegie and how does he talk about the strikers? Okay, so Carnegie, he talks about making offerings to the god of commerce. He refers to him derisively as the master of the mill. He calls the Pinkertons rats and paid assassins. He calls them mercenaries and Hessians. Hessians are the German troops that George III brought over to attack George Washington during the American Revolution, right? So he has all these terms that he uses to refer to the Pinkertons as rats and so on. But the strikers, on the other hand, the other side, they're men of heroic soul. The leader is cool-hearted and brave. The mob of strikers is called the voice of labor, shrieking to the wage worker to rise up. Clearly, the author sympathizes with the strikers, right? He sympathizes with those who are striking because he calls them men of heroic soul, cool-headed and brave, whereas the other side, they're assassins, they're rats, they're mercenaries working in the pay of the god of commerce, right? So this clearly helps us to see where the author's bias is. The inferential reading helps us to make inferences about the author's bias. But that's not the only reason it's valuable. It also helps us to identify anything else the author communicates beyond the actual text. So I guess just, the author's opinions, things the author might be communicating beyond what he says. So it's very valuable that way. And people often ask me, what can we do about bias, recognizing bias in historical sources? I've talked about this before. One of the great ways to do this is to teach students inferential reading, to learn how to recognize things that are being inferred that aren't spelled out. That's very important. So that's another level of reading. That's the second level of historical reading. The third level is what I call critical analysis. Now, critical analysis is really like a meta-analysis. It's where we're stepping back outside the work and we're not dealing with the content of the work so much anymore, but we're looking at the work as a whole and comparing it to other texts. We're analyzing it in light of its genre. We're no longer analyzing it for its historical content, so to speak, but more like its identity as a historical text itself. We're looking at it not as history, but as historiography. So, for example, in Gawain and the Green Knight, famous story of Arthurian legend, medieval story about one of Arthur's knights that chops off the head of a green knight and then goes on this big adventure. If we're looking at the level of basic retention, I might just ask the students, what happens in Gawain and the Green Knight? Who is Gawain? What does he do? What happens in the story? Level 1. Level 2, inferential reading. What is the moral of the story? What is the author inferring about themes such as honesty, courage, keeping one's word? Okay, what is being inferred about these themes through the story of Gawain and the Green Knight? That's level 2. Now, level 3, critical analysis, I might say, in what ways is Gawain and the Green Knight an example of the genre of medieval romance? You see, now it's no longer about necessarily what the content of the text is. It's more about looking at the text as a text and comparing it to other historical texts, to other things in a genre, and identifying how it lines up and why, okay? Or, for example, I might look at a text like St. Bede's History of the English Church and People and say, how does St. Bede incorporate biblical images into his history? How does he use biblical images to tell his historical narrative? It's very meta. We're looking at the text as a history text itself and analyzing it as a historical text. So what sort of skills does this build? What sort of skills does this build? It builds what is often called higher level thinking skills, analytical reading, looking at a text and analyzing it, literary criticism, synthesizing information, taking lots of different types of information, pulling them together to make a judgment about a text. This is very age appropriate for older high schoolers, 11th and 12th grade. It's a great segue into college level reading. This is the sort of reading you have to do at college level, whether you're doing, I don't care if you're doing history, it's going to happen in literature, it's going to happen if you're studying the sciences, law. You have to be able to look at a text through the eye of critical analysis. So here's an example. If you're a little confused on what critical analysis is, in my ancient Roman history class, in the end of the semester, we get to the late Roman Empire, and we get to the age of the barbarian invasions, and we have this story where Attila the Hun invades Italy, and he's coming down into Italy around the year 452, and as he's approaching the city of Rome, Pope Leo the Great and a delegation of the Roman Senate go out to meet Attila to try to convince him to not attack Rome. And Leo's delegation is successful. Attila is very impressed by the Pope, and he turns around and he leaves Italy, and he agrees not to attack Rome. Very famous historical event that's been written about many times. And I have the kids read different accounts of the same event. Okay, so shortly after the event happened, it was written about by the historian Prosper of Aquitaine around 452. He wrote about it just a few months after it happened. So I have the kids read Prosper of Aquitaine's account. Then I have them read another account that was written many decades later. And then I ask them to compare and contrast how the accounts are different in style, in form, in content. Just compare the two accounts. Because Prosper of Aquitaine's account, it's very dry, it's very matter of fact. It just says, at such and such a time, Attila the Hun came into Italy, Pope Leo and these people met him, they talked, Attila turned around and left. It's very just basic historical narrative. The other version they read is much more embellished. There's miraculous visions of angels standing behind the Pope. The author puts a long-winded speech into the mouth of Pope Leo with lots of prayers and orations. There's lots more narrative built into it. It's more dramatic, right? It's much more exciting to read. And the kids notice the difference. They say, well, this one's more just bare bones facts. This one has miracle stories. It has prayers and texts that are put into it. The second one reads more like hagiography, like it's a saint story. The other one is just more bare bones history. So when we are studying history this way, we're doing a critical analysis. We're studying the text of Prosper of Aquitaine and the other texts, not just for what they're saying, but looking at their value as historical texts themselves. We're looking at it from the point of view of historiography, how these have value as historical sources, how they compare to other historical sources. In what ways are they the same, what ways are they different? So we're actually kind of stepping back and looking at the document as a historical text itself and comparing it to other historical texts. So that's critical analysis, and that's helping us to build higher level thinking skills, literary criticism, analytical reading, synthesizing information, the sort of skills a student needs when they're really wanting to really not just read a text as a student who's receiving from the text, but who can also stand back and pass judgment on the text itself. That's some higher level thinking stuff right there, when you're not just at the mercy of whatever the text is telling you, but when you can actually critique it and pass judgment on the text. So that's the three levels of historical reading: basic retention, what is the text saying? Inferential reading, what does the text say beyond what is written? And number three, critical analysis. How does this text compare to other texts, to a genre, how does it measure up? You pass a judgment on the text, so to speak. So if you can start with these primary sources in latter middle school, just doing basic retention, and then gradually ratchet it up over the next 5 years, by the time they get done with high school, kids can be very, very well refined in reading complex texts and making critical judgments about them, which is definitely what you want by the time they go to college, especially into adulthood. And as they're going to get bombarded with all sorts of information over their lives and need to be able to think critically about it. It's an excellent way to do it, and to get educated historically, and probably hopefully to see how exciting history really can be and how much you can really draw out of it. So at any rate, I hope this is helpful for you. If you want to learn more, again, you can visit my website, philipcampbell.net. I have various articles about studying history, articles about various things in history. And you can look at all my books too. If you go on philipcampbell.net, look at publications. It has links to everything I've ever published. If you want to follow me more, if you're on Facebook, you can look me up, Philip Campbell, author, teacher, or on YouTube, Mr. Campbell Explains. And also, if you want your children to be educated by me in their historical studies, I encourage you to go to Homeschool Connections Online, which is the website, homeschoolconnectionsonline.com, and you can register for my classes there. So thank you for listening to my talk, and bless you in your educational studies, and always remember, history is awesome, as I say online. Take care, everyone.